Moving on to how the drug works. Anything that damages brain function tends to make people more docile. Do you know that for all the kids that we're giving Ritalin so they'll sit still in school, there's probably 2 other kids smoking dope to try to do the same thing, to make it through the day, or drinking to make it through the day? Almost any toxic agent lets people get through the day. But Ritalin and stimulants are particularly interesting, and here we have this whole bunch of animal research, which again, so help me God, the guy at NIMH who's in charge of child pathology had never heard of, and is in charge of this conference has never heard of. And the studies on animals show universally what the drugs do to all children and animals. It has nothing to do with whether you have a disorder. That would be like saying when you saw a drunk on the street, why, he must be susceptible to alcohol. It's nonsense. Drugs affect everybody the same way, basically, accounting for normal human variation, which is, of course, fairly wide, but they basically affect you the same way, whether you are hyperactive, underactive, mean, nice, nasty, whatever. Drugs affect your brain, the machine, in a certain way. It doesn't matter whether you have ADHD or not. And, of course, and this they do know, the experts. They're not going to tell you this, but this they know. This is in all the textbooks. So we can see what happens to a rat, and we can know what effect these drugs have on behavior. First, let's think about what a rat's like. Some people own pet rats. Ever owned a pet rat? They're really sweet. They're very active. They're very inquisitive. They're very friendly. They socialize. They explore. In fact, all creatures, all of God's creatures of any complexity are full of trouble. They're always looking, smelling, trying to get out, not wanting to be caged in. And if they are youngins, they're all driving their parents crazy. And we all watch the Discovery Channel enough to know that mama bears just have to whack their little ones and push them aside once in a while. They never hurt them, but they got to do, I don't mean whack them, but they all got to try to control the rambunctiousness of play. This is about all young. And we used to think it was about children. There's no society, pre-industrial society, there's no so-called primitive society that ever assumed that its children should get up in the morning, move to the center of camp and sit there all day long while one boring tribesperson taught them about the woods, the birds, and the trees. They let the kids loose and had them taught by a lot of people. This is unheard of to expect this of children. So what happens? Now that I've told you what rats are like, that they're like puppies. What happens if you give a puppy Ritalin? It has 2 effects. First, it stops all spontaneous behavior. It knocks out exploration, novelty seeking, no matter how you define it. And the animal people have all kinds of ways of defining it. It knocks out spontaneous behavior. But then it does something very curious, perhaps by its effect on the dopamine nerves, and there's a huge nerve center in the brain that to some extent has an effect on compulsive activity. By overstimulating that center, it makes the animals compulsive. And the language is interesting. They call it stereotypical behavior. Instead of exploring, they just look at their paws or chew the bars. They don't even pace around the cage anymore. Instead, they stay in one corner and move back and forth. The behavior becomes what they literally will call in the animal literature meaningless, robotic, over-focused, obsessive-compulsive. It makes a good caged animal. We are making good caged children. Absolutely no question about it, at the risk of their brains. And I've only begun to touch on the adverse effects of these drugs. They often make kids worse because they have such a negative impact on the brain that after the first dose, research has shown, by the evening, the child's brain's rebelling. After the very first dose. And the original research was done on normals. Don't let anybody kid you that there's a difference between how this drug affects normals and other kids. If they tell you that, they're either lying or really ignorant. Nobody thinks that anymore. It's a PR thing. Oh, it just affects ADHD kids. It's a PR thing. So that by the evening, the odds are your child may be worse. because the brain's rebounding. So what's the doctor going to do? Well, after a few months, you'll have him on Klonopin or some sedative at night, or maybe another dose of Ritalin. Then the kid won't sleep. Interestingly enough, there aren't 5 studies in the 10,000 in the literature that ask children how they feel. What does that tell you? The studies that do indicate first that the children lie to the doctors. Of course they do. They tell them what the doctors want to hear. And second, that even though they're lying to the doctors, you can still tell that they basically are made uncomfortable by it. This is not a nice experience, unless you want to become a speed freak. Up your dose and keep yourself going. By the way, all this was known not just from animal studies, but from studies of Ritalin addiction, which now those studies are 30 years old. What happens to people who become addicted to Ritalin, amphetamine, and methamphetamine is they begin to do compulsive, stupid behavior endlessly. For example, they wash a car all day. One of the studies I'll be citing at my NIH conference found that more than half the kids became compulsive when you really look at what's happening to them in an ordinary clinical trial. And the kids would do things like finally rake the leaves. Hey! Well, the kid's out there raking the leaves for 5 hours. Then he's sitting on the ground catching the leaves. It develops self-defeating, meaningless behavior. Now, it's a continuum. If it's just a little self-defeating, a little docile, a little robotic, that's called good school behavior. When it gets extreme, they call it an adverse drug reaction. But it's all adverse drug reaction. The whole thing from start to finish. The drug is not improving the brain. It's one giant adverse drug reaction. But because it makes children docile, compliant, flattened spontaneous behavior, and makes them willing to do rote, compulsive behaviors, we consider it an improvement. Now, I'm not blaming parents. There isn't a parent in the world, unless they've heard me, who has heard this. And by the way, the Ritalin book, I document all this, and I've got even more, because I put a research assistant on research in the last 2 years now, and we've got a ton more of animal research now, confirming the brain damage and confirming the behavioral stuff. It's hard to even know how to begin to think about ourselves that we're doing this. It's about ourselves. It's not about our kids. If you look at the diagnosis, and I'll finish on this theme, if you look at the diagnosis, actually, one of my pages I reproduce the diagnosis, if I can find it. Going to help me find it? See? Here we are.
121 or 216?
143. Let me read to you from the diagnostic manual. Because what you're going to see is that this diagnosis, I'm going to do it without my glasses so my nose will be in the book for a minute, but what you'll see from this is that this has actually been developed over several decades as a list of things that teachers find annoying. Now, if you think, you're going to think I'm joking, you're going to think I exaggerate. Now I'll read you the list. There are 3 different lists. One is for inattention, one is for hyperactivity, and one is for impulsivity. Those are the 3 basic breakdowns. And they go in order of what's called power. The first symptom listed is the one that's considered the most proven diagnostic symptom. Under inattention, I'll go in the order. Inattention, this is number 1. This is the power. This is the disease. Often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, work, or other activities. That's the disease. That's his number 1 criteria under inattention. Number 2 is often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activities. These are the things the kids do when they're bored, when they're frustrated, when they're not getting the right attention. The attention deficit is in us. Those are the first 2. The third one is often does not seem to listen to when spoken to directly. I know it. I've raised 4 children. I know what's going on when they stop listening to me. I mean, I got some idea, and it ain't something wrong in their biochemicals. The second one is the hyperactivity, impulsivity, and its hyperactivity. Listen to this. This is the powerful one, the number 1. Often fidgets with hands or feet or squirms in seat. Why would a child do that? I mean, if we didn't believe this nonsense about a biochemical disorder, why would a child squirm in their seat? I could probably, in 5 minutes, have this whole room squirming if I got boring enough. Or if you got upset enough with me, if I was mean, if I attacked you instead of my colleagues. You could make me squirm, too. This isn't one way. Any one of you could make me squirm. Number 2, often leave seat in classroom or other situations in which remaining seated is expected. By whom? Whose disease is it? Is it a disease of expectations? Then under impulsivity, I love this one. I love the first most powerful symptom under impulsivity. Often blurts out answers before questions have been completed. There's a little brat. I still do that. Reporter starts asking me something. I know what you're asking me. Let me answer the question. Finally, I say, stop asking questions. I'll give you all the answers. And I do that. They say, my God, you did. You gave me all the questions I was going to ask. So I don't even interrupt anymore. I tell them to stop. That's how hyperactive I am. This is serious. This is how your kids are being drugged, by this nonsense. This is a list made out by a bunch of guys who sat down and figured out the behaviors that you need to control to make kids into robots in class. Then it got spread to home life, too. Now, all these things are normal. But what happens if you have a child who's really out of control? I had a little girl in my office the other day who was so out of control that even I had trouble calming her down. I can tell you that, with this one exception, every child who's ever walked into my office and has been claimed to be hyperactive and out of control has within 3 minutes thought it was the greatest thing in the world to hang out with me, and we have a great time. I mean, it's just, people here are nodding. We've all been through the same experience. It's so common they put it in the diagnostic manual. Don't be fooled if the child isn't hyperactive with you. Now, can you imagine that? Imagine that. Okay, we got a diagnosis, brain tumor. Don't be fooled if the tumor's not there when you're with the person. Multiple sclerosis. Don't be fooled if the person's fine when they're with you. It's bizarre. It takes the full authority of billions of dollars and doctors who are distorted in their thinking to sell that you can have a disease that only comes out with people who are boring. Or people who have lost control of their children. God knows I lost control of all of mine. Now they're all out of control, gone on their ways. Not a one of them is exactly what I'd hoped. Some of them are more than I'd hoped, and I mean, it's confusing. I thought that I'd raise these kids and then I'd give up these products and I'd know what they would look like and how. It's not like that at all. It isn't like that at all. They just go and be themselves, for better or worse. And this is about not letting that happen. This diagnosis is about stopping that process, killing play, literally. This drug kills play, kills initiative, kills spunk. Most drugs do that. Many of you in this audience, or certainly many people, have seen their kids slowly get hooked on drugs. What happens? They lose the sparkle. It's the first thing that goes.